Morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Good morning, good morning, good morning. Well, we'll get you another stool there. Yes. Yeah. What was that called in the old Baptist church? You know, I wasn't necessarily just a Baptist church, but like those churches that'd be like a sinner's bench. You know what I'm talking about? Crying bench? Anyway, I'll Google it later. But it's like if you really felt like a piece of crap and you needed some Jesus, you'd go sit on like the bench up there. Yeah, I forget what that's called. Are we recording, Sean? Gosh dang it. This is every bit of it. Welcome, everybody. Good to see you all this morning. We're at, in fact, I'm getting notifications. Hey, you're being recorded. Quit talking. Okay. Thank you, Esty. Now, today we're going to start on page 62, Passions in the Body. Again, we may or may not get through the entirety of the chapter. Because while we might not get to the individual passions that she outlines, which is not an exhaustive list, but a decent list, a good start, is that before you get to the actual passions themselves, it is helpful to understand the psychology and understandings of the desert folks of how they saw soul, mind, and body and how those played and interplayed together, and how that psychology is a little bit different than our current day psychology, and how we understand the metaphysics of what it means to be human is different now than it was then. That's why this section kind of exists, to kind of tease that out a little bit so that you can appropriately approach these passions as they were approaching them. Because if you approach them the way that we might straight ahead, you're gonna really mess up. You're gonna do some harm. You're gonna not really understand. Like for instance, contemporarily, we encounter fasting generally as a form of dieting, right? And we're coming at fasting. I've seen it's very popular to fast. What's it called? Micro-fasting or intermittent fasting. Right? And it's a way for weight control. But really, that type of fasting isn't a spiritual discipline at all, right? It's actually a fasting that's controlled by the passion, right? It's actually a passion control, or it's a fasting practice controlled by gluttony rather than trying to control gluttony. Are you with me? Or it's a fasting practice trying to address avarice, right? But that fasting practice is being controlled by avarice rather than trying to control avarice. Does that make sense? So we'll approach these spiritual disciplines in a very, very, I don't know if intermittent fasting is healthy or not. I don't really care. The point being that from a spiritual discipline standpoint or from the goal of love, we will engage with these passions inappropriately or improperly and even potentially harmfully if we're not mindful of how they engage with them, and then we can reimagine, okay, how can, in our context now, what's an appropriate way to engage with them? Does this make sense in some capacity? So that's why this section is important to kind of take some time to move through before we get to all the passions themselves. But we might get to it today. So I don't know if there's any other housekeeping, but we're going to start on page 62. We'll work our way as far as we get. I think that we're set to kind of continue to move through the rest of the book. The schedule, and I forgot to email last Thursday. I apologize. I'm just now remembering. But the schedule has us kind of on point. We're a little bit behind on the schedule, but we built in a buffer at the end where we can actually tack on another week if we need to, or collapse the last chapter very, very, like the conclusion stuff really, really quickly and expand other sections. So I think we're doing okay. Sean or Dan, any information that we need to communicate off the get-go? There's no class next week? That's right, thank you. There is no class next week because there's spring break. There won't even be a recording next week. Thank you very, very much. So if you want to jump ahead in reading, that's fine. Or if you want to kind of explore some You know what I might do this Thursday? I might send an additional reading that's not this. I might send something from John Cassian to you, just an excerpt that you can read and think more about Cassian's notion, maybe a fiery prayer, or what that might look like. So maybe I'll send some supplementary stuff that's not Bondi, and you can read that at your leisure. It's not required, but something that might be adjacently appropriate, but a little fun, if fiery prayer can be fun. No. Okay. So always want to start with prayer, and then we'll get to if there's any words, comments, phrases, ideas, concepts that you read or that you encountered in the past that would be helpful that you want to elevate. I've always made space. Very few folks have taken up that opportunity, but I always like to make that opportunity available. Please note that that space is there. So let's pray, and then we'll get to things. Gracious and loving God, as we are in this Holy Lent, guide our hearts that they might be dried out and sapped of all of the excess, all of the worry, all of fear, that we might then turn to you in our awareness and our deep need for your compassionate love. And so empty us this season, empty our hearts, empty our minds, empty our spirits, that in time we might anticipate the resurrecting power of Christ Jesus our Lord. It is in the name of the Spirit we pray. Amen. Anything from previous or readings that you want to elevate that we want to make sure we cover? Great. On page 63, too, just opening comment here. We really do tend to have today, 2025 in America on the Western side of things, we really do have this kind of schizophrenic relationship between the mind and body, the soul and body kind of split. We often split the soul and the body when it's convenient to do so, but we retain it when it's convenient to do so. We keep them together when it's helpful. So, for instance, whenever we think about death, whenever death happens, we tend to split the soul and the body. The body will be here in a casket, and then people will say, well, my beloved isn't really here, right? Well, you know, are you with me? But then whenever we're maybe out in the world and we're living our life and we're doing our thing, we keep the soul and the body connected, right? So we'll talk with people and say, well, you need to do this thing because it's good for your soul, even though it's a physical practice, right? And so like while we're alive, the mind and the body and the soul, they're all together. But for whatever reason, when we're dead, as an example, we'll split it. And that's maybe Greek, but that's not what we come out of. That's not the biblical tradition that we come out of. It's always together. They're always together. So when our beloved is here, our beloved is here. When we get into this kind of passions stuff, to say that it kind of tempts the spirit or tempts the soul or kind of pulls us away in some sort of spiritual sense, notice that they're all very physical manifestations, right? There's gossip, right? You know what I mean? There's fear of not having enough. There's gluttony. They're all very physical manifestations of a spiritual kind of pain or discomfort or diversion. So they understood very keenly that soul and body are fused together, right? That there is no splitting. Neil? Sure. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so Neil's highlighting this idea that what's the problem or what's problematic about if there's a body here and then we might say, well, they're not really here, their spirit, their essence is somewhere else. What's really the problem with that? I think that it's problematic less for the person who's here and more for you. That is that we rarely will ever actually confront death. That even in the moment of death, when we're looking death in the face, we refuse to accept death as a reality because there's some part that's still living that never died. And so when we Was that a bird? Was it the eagle? Okay. Yeah, that, mostly they get knocked out and they kind of fiddle about, but sorry about that. That'll make it into the movie yeah. So when we don't confront that things actually die, right? As we live, we are still under the spell and the fear, really, of death. And so death still has power and potency over us because we are unwilling to accept that anything truly 100% completely dies. But we say this in the creed. Jesus died. And one of the creeds even say he descended to the dead. Like he was dead, right? And even that, even completely 100% dead, we say that he was raised, right? That death was conquered. We do not allow, with our splitting, I think that we leave our spirits and our souls and our bodies open to the hostility of death still. That we are actually unwilling and so fearful of death that we won't even entertain that someone could die completely even for a minute, much less 3 days. That it might actually indicate that we don't fully believe in a bodily resurrection, right? That we don't actually believe that you need to be resurrected because you never really died. In the ancient church, there was this thing called Gnosticism that really struggled with this idea that Jesus died. And they said the same thing. Well, he didn't really die. That was just his body. It was a facsimile. It wasn't really Jesus. It was like an image or kind of a pseudo-Jesus. But the essence of Jesus never died because God can never die, right? And pay attention to what we're saying here. If God can never die, then that means that there's something that you and I experienced that God never experienced. Therefore, we have a leg up on God, right? That means that are you with me? Like we would experience something that God never experienced. And so when we're talking about, like, have you ever talked with somebody and you're going through a trouble? If something tragic has happened in your life and you're talking to somebody and they've never experienced it, you know what I mean? Like they can empathize a little bit, but you're like, you don't, there's a lack of connection there. That's why there's cancer support groups, you know? Like you've been through it, you know. So I would submit that the splitting of the body and the soul, even today at a funeral, is a psychic capacity for us to shield ourselves from the truth of death, and therefore we never really encounter the truth of resurrection. If nothing dies, then it can't be resurrected. It's just resuscitated. Are you with me? So the splitting creates the conditions that call into question, do you really believe in resurrection? Because something has to die for things to be resurrected. Otherwise, you just went to sleep, you know? So I think that funerals are super, super important. Yes, for the grieving family, but also for you and I to confront the abyss, to actually face death in its totality. And can you, like the ancient church did, say, death, oh death, where is your victory? Where is your sting? I don't fear you anymore. You have no dominion. You have no power. You have no agency over me anymore. Because even when someone or something dies, 100% dies, I know that that's not the last word on any of this. The more that we split and the more that we retain some sort of essence that never dies, I think that we are handicapping ourselves when it comes to actually facing the real stuff of life. Take that for whatever it's worth. That's a little excursus, but I do think that the splitting does create more control death has over us than actually liberation from. When you die, you die. we're all going to die. We're in Lent, that's the season for it, right? And if we're immobilized by that or petrified by that, then it's a bit of evidence, right, that we are actually still ensnared by the gloom or the doom or the death factor rather than enlivened by the hope that is resurrection, you know? So I don't know if that makes, I didn't mean to kind of beat that horse to death, but does that make sense? Yeah, okay. You don't have to agree with it, but I think that's a danger in the splitting. There's other dangers, but I think that's the bigger one for us today as it relates to this stuff. The body is the locus of limits on page 63. She goes on to say the body is kind of the locus, like the location of limits. These limits are often seen as passions. She said here in the middle of the page there, the need for sleep and food and the inevitability of death are all passions, though clearly not ones we are responsible for. If we remember that a passion has an outstanding characteristic, its ability is to prevent love. We can understand why these physical needs are lumped with anger, envy, and boredom. A mother who has gotten up with a sick child a dozen times in the night, in her exhausted sleep, may not hear the child when it cries one more time. A person hungry and tired, ready to leave for work, may not be able to listen sympathetically to a coworker's problem if the person chooses to unburden at 5 o'clock. The body, so there's a lot of critiques that the desert mothers and fathers thought people look at the practices, the aesthetic extremes of the desert mothers and fathers as anti-body, that they hated the body. They would lacerate. They would put it to its extreme because they think that the body is somehow bad or corrupted and therefore needs to be shed, right? Like some sort of cocoon or a chrysalis. This is a misreading and a misunderstanding of the desert tradition. Yes, there were some desert mothers and fathers, particularly in Syria, less so in Egypt, but particularly in Syria, who did weird, crazy crap. However, it was not rooted in the idea that the physical is bad or sinful. I would submit that our current American culture actually has that idea of the human body, and we're projecting it back onto other periods of time and saying, see, they also did. And we're using old stuff to justify the ways that we beat the crap out of our own bodies. And we do that usually psychically or psychologically. We look in the mirror and we think, I'm not as young as I used to be. I'm not pretty. I don't have any hair. I'm too whatever. Like all of the things, right? We just beat the crap out of one another with our physicality. We actually moralize it, right? If you're diabetic, there's something wrong with what you ate. That's on you. If you're overweight, that's on you. If you're you know what I mean? Like whatever ailment you have, that's on you. That's a moral expression. And it's manifested in your physical body. And so if your physical body's bad, your morality's bad. Look at any Instagram influencer or any person pushing wellness. This is kind of in the ethos, in the water. This is exactly what we hear in the book of Job. Job goes through hell. He's sitting on a dung pile scraping his sores. And his friends come along and say, well, it's probably something you did, right? It's probably something you did. And the fact that you're not even admitting that it's something that you did, that you're not taking responsibility, that's the thing. Like, you know what I mean? Like all of those arguments are manifested today as we talk about in American culture, especially about how we treat and view bodies, physical bodies, ourselves and bodies of others. There are some people in power who think that it is their right to dispose of, abuse, use, deploy, objectify other bodies. Right? Because they're just bodies. They're not the soul. They're not the real essence of the person. Right? Does this make sense? So that's not how the desert folks understood the body, though, or why they would go through this. They recognized actually that the body is a beautiful reminder that you and I are not God, that we have limits imposed upon us. And that these limits create conditions for us to recognize and to practice humility, which we've already said, humility is the path to love, right? So I have a 17-year-old son. He's a boy, and he's in this age and stage of his life where he wants to wrestle occasionally. Has anybody ever encountered a 16, 17-year-old boy that wants to exert his physical dominance over his father? I won't tell him this, but he could win right now. I've got a bum shoulder and a jacked up ankle, and he's stronger. The only thing I have is I'm fatter than him. Like, that's all I have. I'm 215 pounds, and he can't bench that. Like, that's all I have, right? But he's faster, pound per pound, he's stronger. Like, he could take me, right? But my point in all of that is that, like, the confrontation that he and I have, like, he has this sense that he is without limits, right? And I remember being a teenage boy. And now that I'm 42, 42, I'm starting to recognize I do have limits, you know? And I'm reminded every time I get out of bed in the morning, oh my God, what did I do in my sleep? Like, did I wrestle a bear? Why am I, like, I just laid here and I'm sore. I don't know what I did. I've woken up from an 8-hour sleep and then thought, I could go another 8 hours. Like, I'm tired. I don't know I'm tired and I just slept, you know? So your body is a physical reminder of your limitations where it humbles you, where there was a time where you were the hero, where you were the mighty and the strong and you could do it all, right? Because you were 17 or 22 or whatever. And then your body was like, yeah, but you're not. You're not. And so the body is a nice vehicle to actually midwife you into the practices of humility. And anytime that we try to overpower the limits of our body, you can see we're actually rejecting humility, right? Does this make sense? So they understood that the body was the locus, and this is good news. This is why God put us in bodies and not disembodied spirits to just float about, right? Because how else are you going to help everybody universally, prodigally, kind of midwife into humility? Because humility isn't something that we would choose, you know? So God is clever and says, if we put you in limited bodies, you will naturally have the opportunity to walk that path every single morning when you wake up and your knees pop, you know? Does that make sense? So the physical and the passions in the body, the body isn't bad. The body is a conduit. It's a locus of limits that allows you then to kind of recognize that those limits create conditions where you can't love all the time. And if you can't love all the time, you're not God and you need forgiveness. You know, because sometimes you have to sleep and you're not loving when you sleep. You know? She goes on to say that in page 63, what looks like, it was not that they hated their bodies. They simply did not wish to have their lives determined by their physical needs any more than they could help. When love is your goal, anything that impedes that is a source of frustration, right? I want to love fully and completely, and my body is keeping me from doing this. So I can't escape this body. What can I do to minimize, right, the needs of this body so that I could love more often, more fully, more completely, you know? What would the world look like? We do this in economic terms all of the time. What would the world look like if we had everybody work 9 hours a day? What productivity would we get out of everybody if everybody moved to a 9-hour workday? Huh? We'd get a lot more productivity. They are you with me? They did the opposite. What would it look like? What would it look like if we could love, if everybody was able to love 1 more hour a day? And we foregoed our meals to be minimal so that we're eating in 15 minutes, and that allows us an extra hour throughout the course of the day to love. What would that look like? Are you with me? What would the world look like if? So we're not going to eat as much. Not because the body's bad, but because it liberates us to practice more love. Right? Capitalism very much takes that opportunity and co-opts that and then makes you no longer a body, but an object of production, right? The desert people are like, no. We're not producing, we're loving. Like, that's the goal. We want to do more of that. Are you with me? So can you imagine what the world would look like if everybody had an extra hour of love a day? That's what they're shooting for. The body's not bad, but they're trying to minimize its needs. Not because it's bad, but because it gives you the opportunity to love more. Make sense? Okay. On page 65, I'm going to jump over a page here. That story of Abba Marcius of Alexandria, actually on page 64, this is a clever little story that I really, really like. I won't read it, but if you didn't take time, go back and reread that story in light of what we're talking about in body and physicality and limits and love, and what Marcius kind of says and does there. Okay, on page 65, because she talks a little bit about passions as examples that we get to more fully in the latter half of the chapter here. The last paragraph on page 65 is a caution to the church and those of us who are judgmental towards others under the impression that physical is a reflection of spiritual piety. Let's see here. Furthermore, the last paragraphs before we get to the passions and the loss of freedom. Furthermore, we've given ourselves a very serious problem our ancient ancestors did not have. In our time, in which we jog and diet and generally believe that there must be an intimate connection between virtue, physical beauty, health, and a person's worth, we make outcasts of those among us who do not measure up: the old, the fat, the young, but unattractive, the handicapped, etc. That we have discovered that there's no real physical basis for believing in a body-soul dualism provides us with a reason to value people in terms of what they look like and what they're able to do physically. Our churches are as guilty of this amazing confusion as any other group. This is a theology of, quote, wholeness that benefits the strong, ignores the weak. It certainly stands in opposition to the Christian way of life that we're exploring together in these pages. Does that paragraph make sense to you all? So you see, she's reconstituting that argument that we are putting together the spiritual, the moral, and how you live your life can be seen by others in how you physically look, how you physically move in the world. And so if you are overweight, you must be undisciplined, right? Have you heard this? I remember hearing it as a kid. You know, Jason, if you're fat, it is because you are not disciplined enough. I remember watching, I was a kid of the 90s, supermodels, super skinny. And Naomi Campbell telling a supermodel, how does it feel to be a plus-size model? She weighed 100 pounds. You know, in the 90s, we had this weird I'm looking mostly to the women because you probably were much more attuned to this than I was. But like it's gross, right? And therefore, they put them on strict regimented diets, right? In order to discipline them, you know. And if they were disciplined, then that would show that you had some gumption, that you had some energy, that you really wanted it. And those that were the most disciplined looked a certain way. You know? Or did you have something? No. There was a, gotcha. There was a, it's called the Warren G. Harding effect. Has anybody ever heard of the Warren G. Harding effect? I don't need to go into the political pieces of this, but Warren G. Harding was a president of the United States and universally understood as being one of the worst presidents that we've ever had. And it became a question of how did Warren G. Harding become president of the United States? And when they go back and look in the archives and how this kind of, the system came to be and how he was elevated and lauded, the contemporaneous notes were that Warren G. Harding looked presidential. What the hell does that mean? He looked presidential, right? So we're taking what we think a president looks like, finding a body that fits that and says, oh, you are a president because you look it, right? Because that's a reflection that your physicality is a reflection of your interiority. Are you with me? Jesus critiques this all the time. Remember this story? He says, why are you so busy washing and paying attention to the outside of the cup and the bowl? Right? What does he say instead? Wash the inside. Like, wash the inside. Like, that's the stuff that's important, right? So we do this with some regularity in so many different ways. When I was moving through the ordination process, I look like a pastor. I look like what many people think of as a pastor. I'm a young white guy here in Texas. I had zero problems moving through the ordination process. In fact, it was a damn delight. I made those people laugh. In fact, I wasn't ever interviewed, Neil. I interviewed them. I walked into that room like I knew what I was doing. I was scared poopless, right? But I said, well, here's the way I'm going to do this. I'll interview you. Why should I be here with you? Right? And they took it. They received it without a problem. I was passed on through without any problem. I have people who do not look like me, who move through the same process and are met with so many obstacles and confrontations and difficulties that when they talk with me, I have to say, I genuinely never experienced that. And it's not because I'm a good pastor. The good pastor left in July, just so you know. I'm not the good pastor, right? But I look like a pastor, and so I get carte blanche. Other folks in our system, in the United Methodist system, who don't look like a pastor are met with resistance. They just are. We are reflections of the Warren G. Harding effect. We do this even within our churches. We're yoking physical appearance and what we think. So in the end, what we get up having, if I can take this to its logical conclusion, what we end up having is leaders who cosplay the leadership, right? Because they look the part. You know what I mean? If I go to Comic-Con and see 9 Spider-Mans, that's the Jewish Comic-Con, if you will. Spider-Mans. If I Spider-Man, we got bagels. If I saw a Spider-Man at Comic-Con, I know that they're not the real Spider-Man, but they're pretending to be the Spider-Man. They look the part, right? They're cosplaying. We end up, when we are not mindful of this, if you will, passion, we will fall into a situation where we will select, elect, promote, advocate leadership that look the part, but sure as hell shouldn't be in that part. Warren G. Harding. God rest his soul. Right. Esty says, she is a good pastor. Now, if you look on page Loss and Freedom, I know I'm going a little sluggish here. Passions and the Loss of Freedom. I know that I could talk all day. That's a sentence. I could talk all day. And I could spend so much time on this particular section on passions and freedom that it probably could be its own underground seminary of 7 weeks long because of how, but I will not do that. I'll rather kind of move through this with some haste. On page 65, the passions blind us so that we cannot love. And then on page 65 into 66, she gives examples of how the passions both blind and bind us. You can read the example here. Envy is a particularly difficult passion. For example, suppose I have a neighbor who's younger than I. This hypothetical neighbor has a job that pays 3 times what mine pays. She has a lovely clothes, big house, and prospers in everything that she does. I, on the other hand, am middle-aged. What has come to me with great difficulty has come to her easily, so easily that she rather looks down on my own battle scars from life. One day, gossip begins to float around the neighborhood that her marriage is in trouble. I listen with interest, telling myself that I wish her no harm, and I will not pass on the gossip. Nevertheless, I feel a sense of satisfaction ever so slightly. She deserves to get in trouble. Envy makes me see her through a haze made up of my own desire for power, my resentment that my life has not been easy as hers seems, my sense of inadequacy next to her apparent perfections, a touch of humiliation, a straightforward desire for what she has that a secret part of me wishes I had. I may wish to love her, may tell myself that I do love her, but I do not see her objectively, what I might tell myself, and this distortion inhibits my loving her. This passion of envy, right, eliminates freedom to love. You are bound by it. It dictates, it controls, it woos, and it suggests how you should behave. And all of those feelings, we would say, make sense. They're natural. That's a logical, are you with me? We've even kind of sugar-coated it in such a way that kind of makes it palatable, that says actually what you're feeling is natural and good. But Bondi says, no, the natural and good is the love of the neighbor, right? That's natural. What's unnatural is this. That's unnatural, right? But we've kind of self-soothed because we also, I don't want to psychoanalyze folks, but we can get in conditions, right, where we are uncomfortable hearing from that person. So we want to just tell them things that will make them feel better, rationalize their behavior, right? And then therefore allows us in the future to do the same, right? Oh, what I'm feeling, it's not envy, it's a good, healthy competition. You know? Does this make sense? So we've bastardized like what is natural and what is unnatural. Whenever we legitimize these feelings of envy or these passions as natural, those are actually the unnatural things. Are you with me? And therefore be on guard for that. You actually love your neighbor way more than you think you do. You really do. Otherwise, and I'm not joking when I say this, otherwise you would do physical harm to them regularly. You would. Or you would do some psychological harm to them. If you really hated somebody, if you really detested them, if you really thought they were a blight on existence, right? You would hurt them. You love them more than you think you do. They might be a pain in the ass. They might be a nuisance. They might frustrate you. But you really do love them more than you think you do. And so whenever we legitimize our disdain or frustrations as natural, right, or logical, right, what we're doing is we're saying what's unnatural is natural and what's natural is unnatural. So when you see somebody who is a jerk, have you ever had this? And you show kindness to that person and your friend turns to you and you say, how could you love that person? Have you ever had that? Somebody's being a total turd to you and all your friends know that that's a turd person. And then you do a nice thing and you say, how could you possibly do something nice for them? As though it's unnatural to extend niceties and kindness. What are you talking about, man? You're telling me that loving another, showing compassion for another, that's unnatural? Last thing here in this section I would offer up. When you have someone, have you ever experienced this, something like this, where you have is the bird back? Is the bird on the inside? We got a bird on the inside, Sean. Come, Holy Spirit. There you are. Okay. I don't know. Well, he was going to make a scene. Have you ever physically, let me offer this. If you have ever started to have a wound, like you hurt yourself in a way that you're bleeding, okay? You're bleeding. And then, because you're bleeding and you are in pain, right? You are not really able to extend love to other people because you're wounded. There's a pain, there's a hurt, like there's a physical, and we all kind of know that, right? Well, they're short-tempered because they're ill or they're sick or they're bleeding or whatever the thing is, right? And we don't demonize the wounded one for not being able to be at their best, right? Because they're wounded. We know this, right? They're hurt in some capacity. Okay. So a lot of times when we are wounded and we don't see it, we're not bleeding, but we're wounded, right? We will do things that are incredibly narcissistic and selfish to the outside eye, right? Other people will think, you are a narcissistic person that you keep, right? But really, what is more than often happening is that they have a hurt, a wound, a pain that they may or may not be aware of. We are all limping, every single one of us. And sometimes the one who is the real thorn in your side, the selfish, narcissistic SOB that's just a real... Remember, loving is natural, not loving is not. When they are operating in a way that's not loving, that means that that's an unnatural expression. There is a woundedness. Are you with me? Their behavior is an attempt to soothe their woundedness. And so extending compassion to the other is not weakness. Empathy is not a sin, regardless of what the two new books out say. Have you seen these books? The Sin of Empathy, and then another book called Toxic Empathy. These things are not sins, right? This is an acknowledgement that someone is wounded and that they need help addressing their wounds. You are selfish also. I know you don't think that you are, but you are selfish also. And people are kind and generous to you when you are selfish. And your selfishness often, our selfishness often is a response to a woundedness that we don't feel heard, we don't feel seen, we don't feel valued. Are you with me? So these passions create kind of a wooing effect to legitimize behaviors. Are you with me? They legitimize behaviors that give us reason to hate other people or to dismiss them. And the desert folks are saying, no, let's not do that because everyone is wounded. And how do we treat the wounded? Right? Now, how does a Christian claim, how can a Christian claim that everyone is wounded? How can a Christian claim that? Within the Bible, we say that Jesus is God, and we are made in the image of God. And Jesus was wounded. Here, there. And if we're made in the image of God, right, we are wounded also. All of us. So how we respond to that woundedness of self and others, this is where the passions are perhaps its most insidious. It gives us justifying reasons. The passions justify our disdain, our hate, our anger, our envy, our gossip. They justify all of that as, I like your word, Neil, natural, right? Those feelings are natural. That's actually the passions talking. That is not natural, according to the desert philosophy. Okay? Yeah, Neil. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, so Neil's actually one section ahead of me. You're spot on where I'm going, because Neil's highlighting that are the passions therefore amoral. Not good, not bad, they're neutral. And that's a big debate, actually, in the desert tradition. And we'll get to that in just a second. If I can come back to that, I promise I will. But this is exactly where we're headed, right? The underlined section on my underlined section on 67, where it says a person convinced the whole world is out to get him is not free to believe that many people wish him well or are not interested in him at all. A smoker addicted to cigarettes will tell you sincerely there is no proof that smoking causes lung cancer. And besides, we all have to die. Some die of something anyway. A kind of self-induced blindness has taken away her freedom. Are you with me? These passions create the conditions. In our current psychology, we have things that are called motivated reasoning. You've heard of this? Or confirmation bias. You've heard of this? Or the Dunning-Kruger effect. You've heard of these things? I can link to these later, but like these psychologists have understood that human beings are really, really good at deceiving themselves. And that we have motivated reasoning, we have confirmation bias, we have Dunning-Kruger, we have all these effects that now science today has kind of put labels and names on to help us explore them. But the desert people understood them, they just didn't have the specific names. They knew that human beings were really, really good at justifying their passions, right? As good or as moral or as whatever it might be, right? We have a motivated reasoning to do this. There's a famous story of a cult who was convinced that the world was going to end on whatever day it was. I'll just say January 1st. And they all got together, and it was January 1st. And then the world obviously didn't end. And the anthropologist there was interviewing the cult members and said, well, what do you think happened? The world didn't end. You guys were convinced that the world was going to end. And they all said, well, we need to think about it. They looked to the leader, and the leader said, fear not, friends. Do you know why the world didn't end? The world did not end on January 1st because of our faithfulness, right? So there was a motivated reasoning, right, to back into the reality that the world didn't end when they were convinced that the world was going to end and it didn't. They had to there was a cognitive dissonance between these things, and they had to make a leap, right? So they fabricate a thing that says, oh, the reason it didn't end wasn't because the original prognosis was bullcrap. No, the reason it didn't end is because we are faithful. And the gods or the demons or the whatevers saved the world because of your heroic fidelity. Right? Okay, that's a very quick and dirty example of like this motivated confirmation bias, these reasonings, where you are doing things, we are doing things, and then quickly backing out and saying, justifying those things. You see this every 4 years when there's a new president. The Democrats think that the economy is great, and then a Republican is elected. The very next day, Democrats think the economy is crap, and vice versa. Republicans think, it makes zero sense, right? But we have to do that in order to justify our priors, because we don't want to confront the reality that maybe something is happening in the world that I don't like. And instead of confronting that, I'll just legitimize it in a back way, and always I'm the hero of the story. People go back in elections, I don't know if you've noticed or seen or these studies, that they see how many people voted for a particular candidate, presidential candidate each year. They go back and do studies, and on these sample sizes, it turns out that every single time, the winner always gets more votes than they actually got years later. Everybody always remembered them voting for the winning president. Right? You didn't vote for the winning, you know what I mean? 53% of us voted for President, A, but when we do the survey, 75% of us said that we voted for, that didn't happen, right? But we have this motivated reasoning because in retrospect, oh, that was a good president, or I want to be a winner, or I want to, I was good at prognosticating what was going to happen, or whatever the thing is, right? We have a confirmation bias to remove our cognitive dissonance, and we have a motivated reasoning to create reasons to legitimize our actions. This is the work of the passions. This is what passions do. They give you all sorts of good, motivating reasons to do the very thing that is, because they have to give you reasons to do the unnatural thing. If it was natural, you don't need a reason to do it, right? You would just do it. But because the passions, they have to generate reasons for you to be gluttonous, reasons for you to be adverse, reasons for you to be are you with me? Because it's an unnatural expression of what it means to be human. And they are very, very, very good at giving you all of the reasons in the world to continue on the path that you previously chosen despite evidence to the contrary. Right? So the desert folks were very suspicious, right, of why we're doing what we're doing, right? So part of their staying vigilant, not wanting to sleep, is like a manifestation of that. Like, be alert, be awake, right? Don't lull into some sort of sense of security that you know what you're doing, right? Like Jesus in the garden, he tells his disciples, hey, don't fall asleep. He's not anti-sleep, right? Right? It's a metaphor for, hey, you got to be alert, dude. The thieves are coming in the night. Pay attention. You know, desert folks, look, if we could get rid of as much sleep as we could be alert more. Now, that's kind of jacked up and weird because we know that sleep actually helps you stay alert. So, you know what I mean? Like, like there's some stuff, there's some deficiencies there, but you get the sense, right? Okay. Passions, temptations, sins, and demons. On the bottom of 67 and following. So I want to get to Neil's point here. There is a debate within a lot of the desert and the sayings and the desert tradition, which expands several hundred years, right? Of are the passions good, bad, and different, right? So there are some sayings that suggest that the passions are external to us and that they infect us like a disease, right? And that these passions should therefore be eliminated from our life, that they're bad, like a disease. So Amma Slinkatite, she says this, just as the most bitter medicines put poisonous animals to flight, so prayer with fasting expels a sordid thought, passion, right? So there were some that thought passions were external to the human, that infect us, and they need to be defeated. They're bad, right? Others taught that the passions were intrinsically objective, to Neil's point, kind of amoral. And it's just a contingent of the work of the monk to figure out if they're harmful or helpful. So Abba John and Abba Poman Abba John asked Abba Poman what he should do because he had no battle to fight. And so Poman said to him, go beseech God for the battle to come upon you, for it is by fighting the battles, the passions, that the soul makes progress, right? So he's not saying, hey, go pray for a disease to infect you. It's the assumption that these passions, they're not good, they're not bad, they're immoral, but you need to wrestle with them to figure out in which ways are they helpful and in which ways are they harmful. Okay? And yet still another set of desert folk and ancient church mothers and fathers taught that the passions were actual gifts from God. That they have become evil because of how the passions are used. So for instance, Abba Isaiah suggested that the passion of anger, right, which she talks about, the passion of anger, that this passion is for the monk to be angry at injustice. Or that the passion of envy is for the monk to emulate the virtues of other saints, right? So it is contested, debated, argued. What are these things? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they indifferent? So the work of discernment as you're reading the desert sayings, and you got to kind of know, how do these people understand the passions? Are they good? Are they bad? Are they indifferent? Right? And because it's not settled, that is a question for you. Do you find the passions good, evil, bad, indifferent, gifts from God that have been, that is like a wonderful question for you to wrestle with. And when you settle on it, when you kind of come to some resolution, then when you read the desert tradition, some of the people are going to make a lot of sense and some of them will not, right? Because they're doing different things around the passions. Some are trying to redeem them because they're from God, they're good, they need to be redeemed. And others will be like, no, they're a disease, they've got to be eradicated. Are you with me? Okay. The difference of opinions regarding something as essential as the passions suggests that the goal of love is still operating based upon the conflicting sayings. The wisdom of the desert does not eliminate contradictions, but it embraces them for the sake of loving others who may see the passions differently. If one attempts to eliminate, tolerate, or redeem the passions, there still is guidance in these sayings. Are you with me? They kept the conflictual, contradictory sayings in these conversations over the centuries, even when there was deep disagreement on something as essential as where the passions come from. Why would they do that? Why would they do that? Except to recognize, perhaps, that that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is love. And so some of us are going to think passions are this and passions are that or passions are something else. Okay, we'll provide tools and assets and explore all of those because really, what's the goal here? The goal isn't to get right about what the passions are. The goal is love. So let's tassel with all three of those expressions of what we think the passions are and not leave anybody in a lurch. Let's retain the contradiction within the body, right? And the argument in the body, because there's something in the arguing that is a good. And that good is that it leads us to love, right? So if you're looking for this is what it is, you won't find it. You will find this is what it could be. This is what it could be. This is what it could be. And so it depends on the subjective engagement and it depends on the communal involvement, right? And how we tassel with these things, right? Now notice, I'm at time here, but notice also that the keeping of the contradictions of even something as essential as what the passions are structurally builds into the sayings and this wisdom tradition humility. Are you with me? It's built right into the thing. There's no one vein saying, this is the correct way and all of you are idiots, right? They hold all of those in tension appropriately. No one is saying this is the right way and you all are wrong. They are all humble in their approach that, hey, if they're a gift from God, this is how you engage with them. Hey, if they're a disease, this is how you engage with them, right? It's as though they have three branches, if you will, that have checks and balances on one another, that when held properly has a functioning collective, if you will. If only that could exist somewhere. Okay. Last couple minutes here. On page 68, the demons have no supernatural power. Did you catch this? Where are we? Here we are. However, for Anthony, the demons have real existence and hostile beings exterior to himself. He explains, rather his biographer explains, that they have no real supernatural power. They cannot get into our minds and read our thoughts. Instead, they watch us carefully and read our body language. They're not able to predict the future. The demons, she goes on to say, the demons have no more power over us than we grant them. They're unspeakably malicious and diabolically clever, but they're only able to attack us at points of vulnerability. They have no power at all to make us feel or do what we do not assent to. They do have, however, the power to tempt us. This is a clever little saying of Abba Agathon there. When he's, hey, Poman, how do the demons fight against me? Poman said to him, the demons fight against you? This is maybe one of my favorite sayings of the whole collection. I might have mentioned this before. The demons fight against you? They don't fight against us as long as we're doing our own will, for our own wills become the demons. And it's these which attack us in order that we may fulfill them. But if you want to see who the demons really fight against, it's against Moses and those who are like him. So I'm working on, with a guy named Peter Rollins, who he and I are working on trying to create a parable about how the devil retired years ago because all of the demons were being loved by God so much so that they ended up being converted, and that the demons were depleted in their ranks. And the devil's like, crap, I'm running out of demons. How are we going to tempt these people to go astray from God? And then he comes up with this clever plan and says, oh, well, I don't have to tempt them to do something my way. I just let them follow their own way. And then the devil retires and has been sitting in Copacabana for years, right? So like, they don't have this supernatural power. They don't need it. They don't need it. Because we are really, really good at deceiving our own selves and following our own wills. And when we're following our own wills, we don't have to follow the demonic. When we're following our own wills, we're not following necessarily God's will, right? So, okay, I think that we have to end here. And I didn't get to the end of this section, but we'll pick up, if it's okay, can we pick up on the bottom of, according to Abba Poman, ordinary people and monks have no experience of demons at all. If you think you're being tempted by demons, you're not. You know, unless you're Abba Moses or, Amos Sarah, you probably haven't tasseled with the demons. You've probably tasseled with your own will, which is very potent and very strong. Presumably, the rest of us cave in our desires too quickly for the demons to want to even bother with us. Like you're too easy of a fish to catch, as it were. You're not much of a game for the demons. You'll fall too quickly. Over on the top of page 69, Vargas displays little interest in the demons. As far as he's concerned, it's the psychological elements of the passions a monk must attend to. It's not the demonic. So I'll end in this way, I promise. You can see how when we are confronted with our own sin, our own ugliness, our own hurt, our own pain, right? We will lash out at others, right? And human beings have discovered that the more we do that, the more we become isolated, and we can't always do that. We can't always externalize our pain onto others, because then we're isolated and alone, and we're a group species. But human beings have figured out that if, however, we could take all of the ugly parts of ourselves that we don't want to confront, that we genuinely don't want to admit live inside of us, and project them out onto, I don't know, some five-legged creature with horns and a tail, we shield ourselves, we inoculate ourselves from the reality of our own ugliness, our own sin, right? But the desert folks were much more interested in confronting that and recognizing that even with that sin or brokenness or ugliness or wound, even with all of that, do you really believe that you are God's beautiful, beloved, chosen creature? That God calls you my child? Can you believe that? Like, can you really internalize that? So many of us really struggle with that. So many of us really struggle with that. And so it's not me that's ugly or harmful or anger. It's a demon that's causing me to do this, right? We don't really die right? There's something that continues to live on even at the moment of death, right? Because we don't want to confront the reality of real pain and looking into the abyss. Are you with me? And so we project it out, or we create these motivated reasons. This kind of cognitive dissonance gets resolved in some way that is soothing and logical, but probably informed by the passions of protection rather than the truth of the gospel. So as you go forth from this week and into next week, next time when we get together, would you be willing, if you're willing, we'll have some talk time to one another. Not the chief passion that you wrestle with, but the one that you think you've conquered. Okay? The one that you think you've got the most kind of command over. Maybe not even conquered, but the one that you think doesn't really, like that one doesn't nag at your spirit, you know? And we'll turn and I'll try to make note of this, we'll turn and share with one another. And in the hope, in the aim of, well, how have you kind of tasseled with this passion in a way that you feel that you've got some power over it, that it's not binding or blinding you in the same way as maybe other passions. Does that make sense? Of course, if you want to talk about the passions that completely own you and dominate you, you can do that. I thought that might be a bit too vulnerable, but if you want to do that, you can do that too. Okay, amen. Thank you all. Hooray for Jesus.